The rain fell in thick sheets, turning the narrow alleys into glistening rivers of darkness. The sharp scent of wet asphalt and sea salt clung to the air as Seo Jinwan stumbled through the labyrinth of unfamiliar streets, his breath ragged, his mind a frantic blur. His once pristine white dress shirt was now torn and soaked, clinging to his skin like a second layer of cold. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, mixing with the rain as it blurred his vision. He had always believed that power shielded him from the world's cruelty, that his wealth and influence could carve a path free of obstacles. Yet, here he was, wounded, desperate, and hunted like an animal. The city around him pulsed with a life he could no longer claim. Neon signs flickered in the distance, illuminating streets lined with small eateries and convenience stores where people sought refuge from the storm. He envied them. They had no idea what it was like to feel their own mortality pressing down on them, to know that someone wanted them erased. Behind him, the sound of footsteps splashing through puddles echoed. They were close, too close. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but fear propelled him forward. His mind screamed at him to keep moving. A honk. Bright headlights cut through the night. A truck rumbled past, spraying dirty water onto the pavement. He didn't hesitate. Using the momentary distraction, he darted into a side alley, his back hitting the cold brick wall as he sucked in a sharp breath. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then, silence. The footsteps had stopped. He forced himself to listen beyond the storm, beyond his own ragged breathing. His pursuers were searching, their presence looming just beyond the entrance of the alley. They knew he was close. Time was slipping away. If he didn't disappear now, he wouldn't get another chance. His gaze darted around, searching for an escape. Then, in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, he spotted it, an old fisherman's truck, its cargo bed covered with a worn-out tarp. It was his only chance. Ignoring the stabbing pain in his ribs, he sprinted across the alley, vaulting over the side of the truck and burrowing beneath the tarp, just as footsteps rounded the corner. A voice, low, sharp, and impatient. Where the hell did he go? Another voice, colder, more calculating. He couldn't have gotten far. Keep looking. Jinwan pressed himself against the metal floor, heart hammering against his ribs. He barely dared to breathe as the rain continued its relentless drumming on the tarp above him. Then, the truck's engine roared to life. The movement jolted him, and before he could fully register what was happening, the vehicle pulled away from the alley, taking him with it. He didn't know where it was going, but anywhere was better than here. The storm had passed by the time the truck came to a halt, leaving only the faint scent of rain lingering in the early morning air. The first hints of dawn painted the sky in muted shades of violet and gray. Jinwan's body was stiff from the long, cramped ride, but he forced himself to stay still, listening. Then, voices. The catch was decent today, a deep, gruff voice said. Better than last week. A second voice, younger, chuckled. Not like we're making a fortune, though. If only the fish knew they were our last hope. Laughter followed, light and easy. A stark contrast to the fear that had been suffocating Jinwan all night. He risked a glance from beneath the tarp. The truck had stopped near a small coastal village, the kind he had only ever seen in travel brochures. Modest wooden houses dotted the landscape, their rooftops worn by years of sun and sea air. Fishing boats lined the shore, rocking gently with the morning tide. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries breaking the early silence. The air was thick with the briny scent of the ocean. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there were no neon lights, no skyscrapers, no shadows lurking around corners. He was far from the world he knew, but was he far enough? The sound of approaching footsteps made his muscles tense. Before he could react, the tarp was yanked away. Who the hell? Jinwan blinked against the sudden brightness. A tall, broad-shouldered man stared down at him, his weathered face etched with suspicion. His hands, rough and calloused, gripped the edge of the truck as he narrowed his eyes. Jinwan scrambled to sit up, wincing as his ribs protested. He had to think fast. I got lost," he lied, his voice hoarse. "Please, just let me rest for a moment." The man, still frowning, studied him for a long, silent moment. Then, with a sigh, he stepped back and crossed his arms. "You're a terrible liar," he muttered, "but you look like hell, and I'm not heartless. You can stay. For now." Jinwan exhaled shakily, his muscles finally unclenching. This wasn't safety. Not yet. But it was a start. The morning light filtered through the low-hanging clouds, casting a pale golden hue over the village. A cool breeze carried the scent of salt and damp wood, making the air thick with the undeniable presence of the sea. Seo Jinwan sat on the wooden steps of a modest fishing house, wrapping his arms around his sore ribs. His body ached from the sleepless night, but it was nothing compared to the exhaustion settling deep in his bones. The man who had found him, Baek Do-yoon, stood nearby, watching him with an unreadable expression. Jinwan knew that gaze well. It was the look of someone who didn't trust a single word he had said. "You got lost," Do-yoon repeated, his voice rough like the wood of the boats lining the shore. "Yet you ended up in my truck of all places?" Jinwan forced himself to nod. "I was in the city. Things got complicated. I needed to get away." Do-yoon let out a slow breath. His sharp eyes flickered over Jinwan's worn-out appearance, taking in the torn shirt, the dried blood at his temple. "You're not a fisherman," Do-yoon said flatly. "And you sure as hell don't look like someone from around here." Jinwan clenched his jaw. He wasn't ready to weave a full lie yet. "I just need some time," he said instead. "I can work. I won't be a burden." Do-yoon remained silent, studying him. Then, with a shake of his head, he muttered, "You'll last 2 days before running back to wherever you came from." Jinwan didn't respond. He wasn't sure if the man was wrong. The village was smaller than Jinwan had expected. Narrow streets wound between wooden houses with sloping roofs, their exteriors faded from years of exposure to the salty air. Nets hung from porches, drying in the morning sun, and the rhythmic creaking of boats swaying in the tide filled the silence. Despite the peacefulness, Jinwan couldn't shake the awareness that he didn't belong here. The villagers were already watching him. Curious eyes followed his every move. A stranger appearing overnight was bound to stir gossip in a place this small. "Don't mind them," Do-yoon grumbled as they walked toward the docks. "You're fresh meat. They'll poke and prod, but as long as you don't cause trouble, they'll let you be." Jinwan doubted that. Suspicion lingered in the air. As they reached the market square, a humble space with wooden stalls displaying fresh fish and produce, a voice rang out, clear and firm. "Baek Do-yoon, I was looking for you." Jinwan turned toward the sound, and for the first time, he laid eyes on Moon Hae-yoon. She was standing near a stall, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders, loose waves framing her delicate face. There was something striking about her, not in an extravagant way, but in how she held herself, self-assured, unshaken. Her sharp eyes flickered toward Jinwan, and for a fleeting moment, a spark of mild intrigue crossed her features. Do-yoon scratched the back of his head. "What do you need, Hae-yoon?" She stepped closer, and Jinwan caught a faint scent of jasmine on the ocean breeze. "A few of my students need extra materials for their assignments. Can you spare some old fishing logs?" Do-yoon nodded, his tone easy. "Come by later. I'll see what I can find." Hae-yoon's gaze flickered to Jinwan again, this time lingering. "And who's this?" Jinwan felt an unexpected tension coil in his chest. Her eyes were unreadable, neither warm nor cold. Do-yoon exhaled. "Some lost city kid who thinks he can handle fishing." A ghost of a smirk tugged at her lips. Is that so? Jinhwan straightened slightly, annoyed by her amused tone. I can handle more than you think, he said, his voice steady. Hayoon arched a brow, clearly unconvinced. Right, she mused. Then I suppose we'll see soon enough. Jinhwan quickly learned that fishing was nothing like business meetings in glass-walled offices. By midday, his hands were raw from pulling ropes, his shoulders aching from lifting baskets heavier than he expected. Every muscle in his body protested. And yet, Do-yoon barely spared him a glance. The older man worked with efficiency, his movements smooth and practiced. The other fisherman moved just the same, a quiet, synchronized rhythm. Jinhwan, on the other hand, stumbled. He miscalculated. He was slow. By the time they returned to shore, he was barely standing. You didn't die, Do-yoon commented, amused. That's a start. Jinhwan wiped sweat from his brow, breath heavy. His old life felt like it belonged to another person. And yet, as exhaustion settled into his bones, he couldn't deny the strange satisfaction blooming in his chest. That evening, Jinhwan found himself standing outside a small schoolhouse on the edge of the village. The air was cooler now, the sun beginning to dip beyond the cliffs. Laughter and chatter drifted from inside the schoolhouse, and curiosity got the best of him. Peeking through the doorway, he saw Hayoon standing at the front of the room, her voice carrying effortlessly as she spoke to a group of children. There was something about the way she carried herself, a quiet strength, a warmth hidden beneath her poised exterior. She caught sight of him then, her gaze locking onto his. Jinhwan expected her to question why he was lingering outside, but instead, her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smirk. Still standing after your first day? She called out. Jinhwan scoffed, shoving his hands into his pockets. Disappointed? Hayoon leaned slightly against the desk, amusement flickering in her eyes. Not yet. Jinhwan couldn't tell if she was challenging him or simply enjoying his struggle. Either way, he felt the need to prove himself, even if he didn't know why. The first rays of sunlight painted the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold as Seo Jinhwan trudged toward the docks. His body ached from the previous day's work, his muscles protesting every movement. But he wouldn't let himself stop. Not yet. The scent of the ocean filled his lungs, the rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore grounding him in the present. He had spent his life surrounded by the sterile scent of cologne and leather, by the hum of luxury cars, and the sharp clink of expensive whiskey poured into crystal glasses. Now, all he could hear was the sea, and it was strangely calming. Thought you'd run off in the middle of the night. Baek Do-yoon's gruff voice cut through the morning stillness. He stood by the boats, arms crossed, watching Jinhwan with that same skeptical gaze. Jinhwan exhaled. Figured I'd last at least another day. Do-yoon huffed a quiet laugh, but his expression didn't soften. Get to work then, he muttered, tossing him a frayed rope. Jinhwan caught it, his grip still unfamiliar with the rough texture. As he moved toward the boat, he noticed the villagers watching him again. Conversations paused as he passed. Eyes followed him, their curiosity laced with something heavier, mistrust. He didn't blame them. He was an outsider. A man who had arrived in the dead of night, injured and secretive. And no one in this village liked secrets. The morning passed in a blur of heavy lifting and mindless repetition. Jinhwan was beginning to grasp the motions. How to pull, when to pause, where to grip. His body still resisted, but the sharp edge of his discomfort was dulling, slowly being replaced by something else, something almost satisfying. Not bad for a city boy, Do-yoon remarked, watching as Jinhwan secured the last of the baskets. Jinhwan wiped sweat from his brow, breathing heavily. Don't sound too impressed. Do-yoon smirked. I'm not. Before Jinhwan could respond, A familiar voice called out from behind him. "You survived another morning?" He turned to see Moon Hae-yoon standing near the docks, her arms crossed, a faint smirk on her lips. She was dressed simply, a white blouse tucked into a flowing navy skirt, her long dark hair tied back in a loose braid. There was something effortlessly graceful about her, a kind of presence that made people take notice. Jin Hwan hated how easily she unsettled him. "Why does everyone keep expecting me to collapse?" he muttered. Hae-yoon tilted her head, considering him. "Because you look like you don't belong." Jin Hwan stiffened. He had heard the whispers, the quiet speculations. Where had he come from? Why was he here? Who was he, really? Hae-yoon studied his expression carefully, as if searching for a crack in his carefully controlled exterior. And for the first time, he wondered if she could see through him. That evening, the village square was livelier than usual. Stalls were lined with freshly caught fish, warm bread, and ripe fruit, the scent of grilled mackerel filling the air. Laughter and conversation drifted through the narrow streets, a stark contrast to the tension Jin Hwan had carried with him since arriving. He walked past the stalls, unnoticed for the first time since he had arrived. It was strange, blending in, even for a moment. Then he spotted Hae-yoon. She was seated on a low wooden bench beneath the glow of a lantern, flipping through a book while absent-mindedly sipping from a steaming cup. For some reason, he found himself walking toward her. She didn't look up as he approached. "You're lingering." Jin Hwan raised an eyebrow. "You noticed." "I notice a lot of things." She finally glanced at him then, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "Are you going to sit, or are you just here to hover?" Jin Hwan hesitated before lowering himself onto the bench beside her. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of waves lapping against the docks and the quiet hum of conversation around them. For the first time since arriving, Jin Hwan wasn't in a hurry to leave. It wasn't until later that night that the unease returned. He had gone to the docks alone, unable to shake the restless energy coursing through him. The village was quiet now, the only sounds coming from the occasional creak of wooden boats and the distant cry of a gull. And then, he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, measured, too deliberate. Jin Hwan's body tensed. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of a shadow slipping behind the boats. His pulse quickened. Someone was watching him. Someone who didn't belong here either. He stayed perfectly still, his breath controlled, his muscles coiled for movement if necessary. But after a long moment, the footsteps faded into the night, and Jin Hwan was left staring into the darkness, knowing that his past was catching up to him. The morning arrived quieter than usual. Seo Jin Hwan barely slept. The footsteps from the night before still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that he was never truly safe. Someone had been watching him. Someone who knew he didn't belong here. Yet as he stood by the docks, watching the villagers prepare for the day, the illusion of peace remained intact. "Didn't think you'd show up today." Jin Hwan turned to see Baek Do-yoon, already hauling a heavy basket of fish onto the boat. The man's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his tone, a quiet challenge. Jin Hwan rolled his shoulders, pushing past the stiffness in his muscles. "You said I wouldn't last 2 days. I'm still here." Do-yoon let out a low chuckle. "We'll see how long that lasts." Without another word, Jin Hwan stepped onto the boat, ready for another day of work. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, an expanse of deep blue that mirrored the sky. The boat rocked gently with the waves, the scent of salt filling the air. The world felt different out here, quieter, more distant. Jin Hwan watched as Do-yoon moved effortlessly, securing the nets with practiced ease. He tried to mimic his movements, but his hands still felt clumsy, his body unused to the rhythm of this life. "You overthink it." Do-yoon muttered, watching him struggle. The sea doesn't care about your logic. You move with it, not against it. Jin-hwan frowned. I don't overthink. Do-yoon huffed. You do. You've got that look. Like you're always waiting for something to go wrong. Jin-hwan said nothing. Because he was waiting for something to go wrong. They returned to shore in the late afternoon. The village bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. The air was thick with the scent of grilled fish and fresh bread, as the villagers prepared for their evening meal. Jin-hwan was about to head back to the small fishing house when he saw her. Moon Ha-yoon. She was sitting on the edge of the pier, her bare feet dangling above the water, her long dark hair caught in the soft breeze. She looked peaceful, her expression distant, as if lost in thought. He hesitated for a moment before approaching. She glanced at him as he sat beside her. You look less miserable than yesterday. Jin-hwan smirked. That's the closest thing to a compliment I've gotten since I got here. Ha-yoon tilted her head slightly. You're still a stranger, Jin-hwan. People don't trust what they don't understand. He turned his gaze toward the horizon. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and pink, the sun dipping lower into the water. And what about you? He asked. Do you trust me? Ha-yoon didn't answer immediately. Then, finally, she said, I haven't decided yet. As the sky darkened, the weight of the previous night returned to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been watching him was still out there. Jin-hwan had spent years surrounded by lies, betrayal, and hidden agendas. He knew when he was being hunted, and this wasn't over. He glanced at Ha-yoon, who was still staring at the sea, her expression unreadable. For the first time since arriving, he felt something unexpected. Not fear, not suspicion, but a strange, quiet sense of belonging. And it terrified him, because he knew it wouldn't last. The sound of waves lapping against the shore was rhythmic, steady, almost deceptive in its calmness. The village had settled into its usual evening routine, the scent of grilled fish and warm rice drifting through the air. But inside Seo Jin-hwan, there was no calm. The shadow of last night's encounter hadn't left him. Whoever had been watching him was still out there, waiting. And yet, instead of retreating into isolation, he found himself walking toward the schoolhouse. The school was small, just a single wooden building with large windows that overlooked the cliffs beyond. The glow of lanterns flickered inside, casting long shadows as Ha-yoon moved between the desks, adjusting papers and collecting books. She glanced up when she saw him. You again. Jin-hwan leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Starting to think you enjoy my company. Ha-yoon huffed a quiet laugh. Hardly. But she didn't ask him to leave. Jin-hwan stepped inside, glancing at the walls lined with old maps and faded posters. It was nothing like the sterile, high-tech schools he had funded in the city. Here, the space was worn but lived in, filled with the quiet warmth of effort and care. Why teaching? He asked. Ha-yoon placed the last of the books onto a shelf before turning to him. Why fishing? Jin-hwan smirked. I didn't exactly have a choice. She leaned against the desk, arms crossed. Neither did I. There was something in her voice. Something heavy. Personal. Jin-hwan studied her. You don't seem like someone who does things out of obligation. Ha-yoon exhaled, gaze drifting toward the open window. The wind carried the sound of distant waves, filling the silence between them. When I was younger, she began, I wanted to leave this place. Go somewhere bigger. Somewhere where no one knew my name. Jin-hwan listened, sensing the shift in her tone. But then, my father got sick. My mother had already passed, so it was just the two of us. She shrugged slightly. I stayed, became a teacher, and then, before I realized it, Leaving didn't seem like an option anymore. Jinhwan wasn't sure what surprised him more, the story itself, or the fact that she was telling it to him. "You don't resent it?" he asked. Hyun shook her head. "No. I think, deep down, I always knew I belonged here." Her words settled heavily between them. Jinhwan should have said something. Anything. But the truth was, he didn't know what belonging felt like. He had spent his life running from one obligation to the next, never staying long enough to let anything feel permanent. But something about Hyun, she was the opposite of him. And for reasons he didn't yet understand, he found himself wanting to know more. The moment was broken by a sudden voice from outside. "Hyun, there you are." Jinhwan turned toward the door just as a man entered the schoolhouse. He was tall, dressed in a crisp white shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows. His dark hair was neatly styled, his expression familiar in a way that immediately unsettled Jinhwan, a face from the kind of world he had left behind. Hyun, however, looked less surprised. "Sungjae," she greeted, straightening slightly. Jinhwan felt something sharp twist in his chest. Sungjae's gaze flickered to him, assessing. "You have company?" Hyun hesitated before nodding. "This is Jinhwan. He's staying in the village for a while." Sungjae's polite smile barely reached his eyes. "I see." Jinhwan recognized the look instantly, a quiet, measured form of suspicion. Sungjae turned back to Hyun. "Your father asked me to check on you. He says you've been spending too much time alone." Hyun sighed. "I'm fine, Sungjae. You don't have to." "I worry," he interrupted gently. "You know that." Jinhwan didn't like the way he said it. He wasn't sure why it bothered him, but it did. Hyun, however, looked unaffected. She simply gave a small, tired smile. "Tell my father I'm taking care of myself." Sungjae studied her for a moment longer, before finally nodding. "All right, but let me walk you home at least." She hesitated, glancing at Jinhwan before nodding. "Fine." Jinhwan watched as they left, an unfamiliar tension settling in his chest. He told himself it didn't matter. But as the door swung shut behind them, leaving him alone in the empty schoolhouse, he realized it did. The night air was thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. Seo Jinhwan sat alone on the wooden steps of Baek Do-yoon's fishing house, his gaze fixed on the dark ocean beyond. The rhythmic crashing of the waves should have been calming, but his mind was anything but still. Sungjae. The name lingered like an unwelcome guest in his thoughts. Jinhwan hadn't expected to care. Not about Hyun, not about who she spent her time with, but something about the way Sungjae had spoken to her, the quiet possessiveness in his tone, had left an unfamiliar unease in Jinhwan's chest. And that frustrated him. Because he shouldn't care. This village, these people, they weren't his. And he had no right to feel territorial over someone who wasn't his to begin with. He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. Then, a sound. Soft, barely noticeable. But it was there. A shift in the gravel near the trees. The crunch of footsteps moving too carefully. Jinhwan's body tensed. Someone was watching him. Again, his instincts screamed at him to stay still, to listen, to let the night reveal what didn't belong. Seconds stretched. The wind howled through the cliffs. Then a shadow moved. Jinhwan reacted instantly. He turned, his muscles coiled for defense. But by the time he reached the edge of the porch, the figure was gone. Only the trees swayed in the distance, the darkness swallowing whoever had been there. Jinhwan stood frozen, his heartbeat pounding like a war drum. It wasn't a coincidence. Whoever it was, they were watching him, waiting. And this time, Jinhwan knew with absolute certainty they weren't going to leave. The following morning, Hayoon found him at the docks. She stepped onto the wooden planks, the morning sun casting a golden glow on her features. Her long braid was slightly undone, as if she had rushed out of the house. "You look like you didn't sleep," she noted. Jinhwan exhaled, leaning against the railing. "That obvious?" She studied him for a long moment. Something happened. It wasn't a question. Jinhwan hesitated. He didn't want to involve her, didn't want to pull her into the chaos that followed him like a shadow. But something about her gaze, steady, patient, unwavering, made him consider telling her the truth. He opened his mouth. Then, before he could speak, Baek Do-yoon's voice cut through the air. "Jinhwan!" They both turned. Do-yoon was walking toward them, a deep frown lining his face. But it wasn't Jinhwan he was looking at. It was Hayoon. "Something happened," Do-yoon said, his voice lower than usual. "Your father sent someone looking for you." Jinhwan saw it then. The way her expression shifted, a flicker of something like frustration, maybe even fear, flashing across her features. And suddenly, he wasn't the only one keeping secrets. The world seemed to still around them. Jinhwan caught the flicker of unease in Hayoon's expression, a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. She wasn't surprised by Do-yoon's words. If anything, she looked like she had been waiting for them. Her father had sent someone looking for her. Jinhwan watched as she straightened, carefully masking whatever she had felt a moment ago. "Who?" she asked. Do-yoon exhaled. "A man dressed too well for this place. Looked like he belonged in the city. Said he came on behalf of your father." Jinhwan didn't miss the way her fingers curled into fists at her sides. For the first time, he wondered, who was Hayoon outside of this village? She had always seemed so grounded, so certain of her place here. But now, standing before him, Jinhwan saw something different. He saw a woman who had been running, just like him, and he needed to know why. Later that evening, Jinhwan found Hayoon by the cliffs. The sun had begun its slow descent, turning the ocean into a canvas of molten gold and crimson. The wind was stronger up here, pulling strands of hair loose from her braid. She didn't turn when she heard his footsteps. "You followed me," she murmured. Jinhwan stopped a few steps behind her. "You don't seem surprised." A quiet breath. "I'm not." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below. Finally, Jinhwan spoke. "Who was he?" Hayoon closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself. When she turned to face him, her expression was unreadable. "My father is influential," she admitted. "He has ties to people in Seoul, people with money, power." Jinhwan studied her, waiting. "I was supposed to marry into one of those families," she continued, her voice steady. "A political match, a convenient merger between old money and new." Jinhwan didn't know why the thought made his chest tighten. She shook her head, almost laughing. "I was young, naive enough to think love had anything to do with it." Jinhwan remained silent. Then her gaze met his. Something unspoken passed between them. "I left," she admitted. "I ran, and I never looked back." Jinhwan exhaled, understanding her in a way he hadn't before. Because he had done the same. Only in his case, his past had followed him. And from the look in her eyes, hers was about to catch up too. The village felt different that night. Jinhwan could feel it in the air. The shift, the quiet tension. He was no longer the only outsider with a secret to keep. And as he sat alone in the dim light of Do-yoon's fishing house, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Then, the knock came. Slow, deliberate. Jinhwan stood, his pulse quickening. When he opened the door, a familiar figure stood before him. Sungjai. But this time he wasn't smiling. You should leave, he said quietly. Jinhwan held his gaze. Why? Sungjay took a slow step forward, his voice lower now. Because they're coming for her. And if you stay in the way, they'll come for you too. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken tension. Jinhwan studied Sungjay, searching for deception in his expression. But there was none. Only quiet certainty. They're coming for her. Sungjay repeated, his voice calm but firm. And if you're still here when they do, you won't get a second chance to walk away. Jinhwan's jaw tightened. Everything in him screamed to ignore the warning, to dismiss Sungjay as nothing more than a jealous old friend, bitter over losing Hayun. But deep down, he knew better. The way Sungjay stood, the way his gaze remained steady, unwavering, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a game. This was a warning. And it wasn't for his sake. It was for hers. Jinhwan found Hayun in the schoolhouse, where warm candlelight flickered against the wooden walls. She was seated at her desk, writing something in neat, fluid strokes. She didn't look up when he entered. You're quiet, she murmured. Jinhwan didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward. The words felt like stones on his tongue, but he forced them out anyway. They're coming for you. That made her still. Slowly, Hayun placed her pen down, lifting her gaze to meet his. Her expression didn't waver, but her eyes betrayed her. She had known. Maybe not the when, maybe not the how, but she had always known they would come. Jinhwan exhaled sharply. You need to leave. Hayun let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. And go where? Anywhere, Jinhwan said. Just away from here. She studied him for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. You don't understand, she said. Jinhwan frowned. Then explain it to me. Hayun glanced toward the open window, where the moon cast a soft glow over the village. Then, she told him the truth. Her father wasn't just powerful. He was dangerous, a man who had built his empire through favors and control, weaving his influence through politics, business, and power. And Hayun, his only daughter, had always been meant to be a pawn in his game. The engagement hadn't just been a marriage, it had been a contract, an alliance between families, one that she had shattered the moment she ran. Jinhwan listened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He knew men like this, had spent his life surrounded by them, and he knew exactly what happened when someone defied them. Hayun lifted her gaze, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. If I leave, they'll tear this village apart looking for me. Jinhwan felt something heavy settle in his chest. She was right. She wasn't the only one at risk. And for the first time since arriving here, Jinhwan realized, so was he. He didn't know how long they sat in silence, but when Hayun finally spoke, her voice was soft. Jinhwan, she murmured. He looked at her. Her gaze was steady, unshaken. Leave, she whispered. A sharp ache rippled through him, because she wasn't saying it to protect herself. She was saying it to protect him. But Jinhwan had never been one to walk away. And he wasn't about to start now. The air was charged with tension, thick enough to suffocate. Jinhwan sat at the edge of Baek Doyun's fishing house, his hands curled into tight fists, his mind racing. The weight of Hayun's words pressed against his chest. Leave. She had asked him to walk away, to save himself. But Jinhwan knew men like her father. Leaving wouldn't stop them. It would only delay the inevitable. And if there was one thing he had learned since arriving in this village, it was that some things were worth staying for. He found Doyun at the docks, gutting fish with slow, practiced movements. "You're making that face," Doyun muttered without looking up. Jinhwan frowned. "What face?" "The one that says you're about to do something stupid." Jinhwan let out a slow breath. "They're coming tonight." Doyun finally glanced at him, his knife pausing mid-motion. His gaze darkened. "You sure?" Jinhwan nodded. Doyun exhaled through his nose, wiping his hands on a rag. "Then we better be ready." The village slept in uneasy silence. Jinhwan could feel it, the tension coiling in the air like a storm waiting to break. He stood near the schoolhouse, hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. And then, at the far end of the dirt road, he saw them. Dark figures moving with quiet precision. Too many to be simple visitors. They didn't belong here. Jinhwan's muscles tensed. The men moved toward Hayun's house. And suddenly, Jinhwan was running. The first punch came fast. Jinhwan barely dodged, twisting his body to avoid the blow. He caught the glint of a knife in the dim lantern light. These weren't just hired men. They were professionals. A second man lunged, but Jinhwan was faster. He slammed his elbow into the man's ribs, sending him staggering backward. Then, a sharp cry. "Hayun." Jinhwan's head snapped toward the house. Two men were dragging her toward a waiting car. Something inside him snapped. And then he wasn't thinking anymore, only moving. The world blurred as Jinhwan fought his way through them. Every muscle screamed. Every movement was calculated. A fist caught his jaw. Pain exploded across his face. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Then suddenly, a gun clicked. Jinhwan froze. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the glow of the street lamp. Choi Sang-hoon, his old friend, his betrayer. Jinhwan felt ice creep through his veins. Sang-hoon smiled, mocking, cruel. "You always were too stubborn, Jinhwan." Jinhwan clenched his jaw. "Let her go." Sang-hoon tilted his head. "Now, why would I do that?" Then, Hayun fought back. She twisted, slamming her heel down onto the foot of the man holding her. He let out a pained curse, loosening his grip just enough. Jinhwan didn't hesitate. He lunged, and all hell broke loose. A struggle, a blur of movement. Jinhwan barely registered the pain as fists connected with his ribs, as the taste of blood filled his mouth. But then, a gunshot, a sharp, deafening crack. Jinhwan's body tensed. For a moment, everything stopped. Then, a groan. Jinhwan turned just in time to see Sang-hoon clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in pain. Standing behind him, gripping an old revolver with steady hands, was Doyun. His expression was grim, unshaken. Sang-hoon staggered, his men hesitating. Jinhwan saw his opening, and he took it. One final punch, and Sang-hoon collapsed. The silence that followed was deafening. Hayun stood frozen, her breathing unsteady. The remaining men hesitated, glancing between Jinhwan and their fallen leader. Then, slowly, they retreated. Jinhwan didn't move until they were gone. Only when the village was quiet once more did he finally turn to Hayun. Her eyes were wide, her hands trembling. Jinhwan exhaled. "It's over," he murmured. But in his gut, he knew better. Because men like Sang-hoon never stayed down for long, and neither did the past. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting soft golden light across the village. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, the world quiet in the aftermath of the night before. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Seo Jinhwan stood near the cliffs, the ocean stretching endlessly before him, the place where everything had changed, where he had almost lost her. The bruises on his ribs ached, a constant reminder of the fight. But pain was nothing new. He had lived his whole life bracing for impact. The only difference was that this time, he had something to lose. Footsteps approached from behind. He didn't turn. He already knew it was Hayoon. She came to stand beside him, her presence warm, despite the cool morning air. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, "You should go." Jinhwan exhaled slowly. He had expected this. "Do you want me to?" he asked, his voice unreadable. Hayoon hesitated, her fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt, her gaze fixed on the waves below. "You were never meant to stay," she whispered. Jinhwan felt the weight of her words. She was right. The past he had run from still existed. Sang-hoon was still out there, waiting for his moment to strike. And Hayoon, she deserved more than a man who carried danger like a second skin. But when he looked at her, standing there beneath the vast sky, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. "I don't care what I was meant for," he said. "I know what I want." Hayoon's breath hitched. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her dark eyes searched his, uncertainty flickering beneath their surface. "This isn't just about you, Jinhwan." He stepped closer. "I know," he murmured. Silence stretched between them. And then, for the first time, she let herself believe him. The village still bore the scars of the night before. But as the sun climbed higher, life continued. Fishermen repaired torn nets. Children chased each other along the shoreline. People moved forward, just as they always had. And so did Jinhwan, because this place had changed him, and he wasn't ready to leave it behind. Not now, not ever.